Okay, so I will just talk now again about projections and inversions, and specifically inversions. The same way we were talking about last week, and we introduced a few of these. We started talking about night and day, or the circle and the line. And we'll stick with some of these elementary pairs of inversions and think about them a little bit more in a little bit more detail. I'm just seeing if what someone has. Okay, if you've got general questions, let's wait until the end, and then we can. I'll talk a bit more in general about a final. I mean, I can already say to you, it's the first time we do this course in this way. So there will be there's no references to a previous version of the course. This is the first one. So this is actually a really good opportunity for you, because I will give you many examples of different kinds of texts, not as in the context of a course like this, but just in the world that we can work with, learn from, and even take things from. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question for now. Let's go into some detail now, and I will resume. Okay, so and projections. So the word projection, it might be something which you already have in your mind in terms of architecture. And so how are we thinking about it here in terms of writing? Well, we might think about spatial organization of text. So in what ways can we play around with spatial organization of text? And how can we think further about these pairs of inversions that we were looking at last week? So projections of space and time. This is what we're talking about, not just space and time, but we start with space and time. And so this text from Ludger, which we've talked about, he has many of these inverted pairs. And I have, this is not from his text, this is my writing using his concepts. And I wrote some of these out. So this is what I wrote. I wrote, you see with your eyes, you hear with your ears, you can't see what you hear. You can hear space. Space is with the circle. Circle is a symbol in space. For example, the square root of 2, imaginary number, symbol in space. Writing is in space. You can see time. Time is with the line. You can see the line. Time and space are orthogonal to one another. Drawing is with the eyes of time. Space is with the day. Time is with the night. So that may not sound clear to you still, but this is just a number of these pairs of inversions placed together. And one of what you see in the image here, and this is from a video. So if you want to hear the writer himself explaining this, there are many videos freely available on YouTube where Ludger explains this structure that he has, in which you can apply almost anything. So he does that in this video, which I will let you can watch that yourself in your own time. There's a link to it there. But anything under the digital architectonics primer, that's if you search for that, you will find his explanations there. And I will just give you one example from one of these videos, which you can see in the image there, and that's a still taken from the video, where he's talking about, you might ask the question, why is hearing with time. Why is hearing with time? Why is seeing with time? And he draws a picture of a stone dropping in some water and these concentric circles coming out. And what you can hear is space. What you can hear is space, not time. Sorry, it's hard. I mean, it's hard for me also, because I get them confused sometimes. But you hear space because you hear the sound, and you hear these circles radiating outwards, and you see time is what you see. So watch the video. But for now, for our purposes, you can just take this as a framework to work with. It's just a framework to work with for you for now. So what we need then, in order to be able to work with these things, is we need some tools to make it easier for us, because to ask you to just write freely without any tools, any new tools, this is very challenging. So we have some simple tools that we have available to us on the internet, very familiar tools, some of them I'm sure, tools that can help you get familiar with these concepts, these elements. So I will show you some of them today. So to simplify it further, what I wrote in that previous slide with all of here, we have night and day, we have space and time, we have hearing and seeing, we have the circle, and we have the line. So without worrying about the reasons why, not yet, we are just treating these as objects to work with. And the tools that we will use to work with these objects today are just the Google Ngram viewer, etym which is the etymology dictionary, and then just a Google search and the autocomplete. So these are tools you can use immediately. They are simple tools with very powerful functions. So first of all, let's start with the etym. So we want to know where these words come from. This is a good start always when you're working with a concept. So you can see with and what I've done is I've gone onto the etym website, and I have placed these inversions and their etymologies next to one another here. So we have the circle and we have the line. They're both nouns. And then you get these descriptions and the languages that they come from, their derivations. And you can see the circle even as far back as 1300. The figure of a circle, a plane figure whose periphery is everywhere equidistant from its center point. And then you see it's from Old French, from Latin, replacing Old English. And then sometimes they give examples of how it's used metaphorically. And it's interesting to see when you do this with line, that there is much more information about line. And so this is interesting data for us as well. So you then can see with line, it's a Middle English merger of Old English and Old line and Old French ligne. So, and then again, Latin, and then lots and lots of examples of how the word line is also used metaphorically, as well as just the geometric element. So the metaphorical usages are intertwining with the literal usages in both of these concepts. And if you think about in whatever language, the concept of circle and the concept of line are really rich for metaphorical use. So you could say, I ran around in English, you could say, I ran around in circles, meaning, and this is a metaphorical way to mean I was kind of running or moving in a kind of pointless, repetitive shape. They didn't get anywhere, running around in circles. So that's a metaphorical way. And then with line, there are lots of other examples, and they give some there. But just off the top of my head, I could think of if someone someone is telling you a lie, you could say, oh, and you know that, you could say, oh, they just fed me a line. They just gave me a line about something. And that's a kind of colloquial way to say someone is telling you something that's not true for some whatever reason. So this is circle and line. And you get the whole history using this etym online. Then you can do the same with space and time. You can see that space is to do with area. And then you can see that if you look at this second paragraph with space from the mid-14th century as distance, interval of space. So that also calls to mind time, and also place, also amount or extent of time. So there's time and space are interrelated they're interrelated in that way from centuries ago. So, and then with time, you have from Old English, Old Norse, and in an abstract sense of time as an indefinite continuous duration. So that's time passing. From late 14th century. You can look at these in your own time. See, it's impossible to get away from how these words are used metaphorically in order to just talk about how we experience the world. So they're very fundamental in that way. And then night and day. You see the derivations and of night and day, both Old English, and then you see the ways in which they are used metaphorically as well. So you have that at your fingertips. Just go to etym online, you can find that information. That will help one way to get into or find your own way into feeling comfortable with these concepts. Another way then is using the engram viewer. So some of you might know this already. If you go to Google Books engram viewer, you can type in a word, a concept, a name, and you can put which of the range of dates you want to look at. And I always want to see from the earliest recorded, which you can't go earlier than 1500. So from 1500 to 2019, you look at all of the instances that Google Books have uploaded to date, all of the instances of these words, of these concepts, and then you can compare with however many. So it's again really useful to put these into the engram viewer. So I did it here with see and hear, and then you look at the centuries where there has been an increase in the usage or a decrease, and how these are comparing, and whether they're moving together, whether they're going in opposite directions, what's the correlation between these two terms. So when you look at Renaissance and you look at this kind of between 15th and 16th, between 15th and 17th century, there's quite often an explosion in one or other direction of use of these terms in one way or the other. And that's interesting in itself as well. So you then could do it with night and day. You then see this huge spike in looking at the use of day. But otherwise, it's kind of more or less moving in the same, they're moving in almost parallel motion with night and day. So you can interpret this information how you choose, but it's really helpful to see and give you some context on some cultural context or some historical context on what's been going on with these terms in the past few centuries. Circle and line. Again, there are some spikes with the word line around 16th century. So maybe there's a lot going on with discussions about drawing at this time, Renaissance drawing, maybe. And line's always been more than circle, but around about the beginning of the 20th century, line was much more than circle, and circle was going down, and now they're getting more closer together. Now, I don't know the reason for that. We could speculate, but it's very interesting and useful data to have. Did I do one more? Yeah, with space and time also. Time is used much more than space, almost always, apart from this moment here. And you can zoom in on a particular date and see more closely what the values are. So this is extremely useful as well. Okay, so other things you can do. You can type in something into your Google search and look at the autocomplete. And this is something which people do for fun. You've probably seen examples of when people do this to get the most ridiculous effect or answers. So I tried this out with a circle is, and you can see a circle is a polygon, a circle is inscribed in a square, a circle is a plane figure, a circle is inscribed in a triangle, a circle is inscribed in an equilateral triangle of side A. A circle is drawn with center as origin. A circle is just an ellipse where. A circle is given by X, blah, blah, blah. A circle is the collection of points in a plane. So when I read it like that, it gives it a different feeling immediately. And you think, what is this list of options? What is an autocomplete? It's offering you possible endings to the beginning of a sentence. And if you put them all in a list there and think of that list itself, we could even say that's a poem. And that's some of the gestures that internet poetics allows us to do. Whether you like it or you don't, that's another question. But it's interesting because it's rendering these options, these possibilities, as a thing in themselves. So there are other examples of using this kind of function in a poetic way. And then it's interesting that a line is denoted as, a line is named by, a line is an undefined term because a line is made up of. And this is, I did not change this in any way. This is exactly what came up on my Google search when I did this, which was kind of funny when I got to a line is like, because a line is like is clearly read often by the algorithm, how it works, as someone mistyping the line about life is like a box of chocolates, which is so famous. And so that's what came up first. So that's also very interesting. So I think there's a lot of material there to play around with in terms of how something is used in the contemporary, in a snapshot of contemporary world. So the autocomplete is another fun tool to use. So I did some more space and time with space and time. The differences between space is like and space is. And then there started, for some reason, songs and movies started coming into my search. I have no idea why, but that's what happened. So I encourage you to play around with that yourselves and see what comes up. Okay, so that's some tools. Let's look at some examples then. Going back then to the early 20th century, all the way through the 20th century, there is concrete poetry. So this is about spatial organization of text. This is another tool we can use. And that if you Google image search concrete poetry, you will get lots of examples like this, whether it's done by handwriting or whether it's done with computer text. And there are historical examples such as Robert Smithson's piece here called A Heap of Language, which is quite literally a heap of text that he's handwritten, 1966. That might not seem very radical to us now, but this is quite a long time ago now. And you can see many, many examples of this kind of, they call it conceptual writing, on this Ubu web site that I mentioned to you in the first week. And then earlier, in the very early 20th century, Guillaume Apollinaire, maybe you know him, he wrote what he called calligrams. And this is the same idea, maybe slightly more abstract in terms of the relation between the shape and the text, but there's still spatial projection going on. So that's another tool or format to play with. What then if we go more to this idea where I was talking about if this gesture of using the autocomplete as a poem in itself, how do we characterize that? What do we call it if we're doing that? There's various things you could call it, but examples of that being done. This guy, Craig Dworkin, who I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago, where he wrote that book called Pars, where he had grammatically analyzed all of the sentences of this old book on grammar and presented that as his text. He also wrote this book, Craig Dworkin also wrote this book, Dictionary Poetics. And in that book, Toward a Radical Lexicography, I will make sure that book is also in the poly box for you to look at. And he's doing a similar thing there. He's taking dictionary entries and presenting them as a poem. And there is something beautiful about it. There's also this example there by Claude Kloski, which is the first 1,000 numbers classified in alphabetical order. So in terms of spatial organization, you remember a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at tables and kind of presenting them, presenting elements in different organizations in order to try and, as an alternative way of kind of apprehending a story or a concept different to writing out a conventional storyline. So this is almost like the opposite of that, because we're still thinking about spatial organization. We're basically still thinking about space and time in writing. That's what all of these things are doing. They're playing around with space and time in writing. So I think these are interesting examples. To read a little bit of someone who's theorizing about this, Christian Bock, he is another conceptual writer, and this text is in full on this Ubu web also. So he's written this text called The Piecemeal Bard is Deconstructed, Notes Towards a Potential Robo-Poetics. So again, this is, I can't remember exactly the date of this, but it's the 1980s or 1990s. It's not up to date now, but he's already saying things such as, and I'll read this bit for you. This is the end of the of the essay, he says, "We are probably the first generation of poets who can reasonably expect to write literature for a machinic audience of artificially intellectual peers. It is not already evident by our presence at conferences on digital poetics that the poets of tomorrow are likely to resemble programmers, exalted, not because they can write great poems, but because they can build a small drone out of words to write great poems for us. If poetry already lacks any meaningful readership among our own anthropoid population, what have we to lose by writing poetry for a robotic culture that must inevitably succeed our own? If we want to commit an act of poetic innovation in an era of formal exhaustion, we may have to consider this heretofore unimagined, but nevertheless prohibited option: writing poetry for inhuman readers who do not yet exist because such aliens, clones, or robots have not yet evolved to read it." So there's quite a lot to think about there. And I'm interested to know your thoughts. So maybe we'll come back and we can talk a little bit about his position there, and you can think whether you agree or how your reaction is to that kind of stance. So just one final thing then, before we can maybe have a bit of a discussion, so that it doesn't feel like we're in this depressing state where we can't say anything new. It doesn't need to be like that. So I thought I would show you one website which works with technology and produces all kinds of new configurations, new ways of thinking, new ways of writing, new ways of reading, new ways of publishing, new ways of collaborating, and new ways of building communities, I would say. And this is a website called Talk, which is here. And there's all kinds of things to look at. The projects that these two artists based in the UK, relearning to read, these are all different projects that they've worked on. So here, this is one of their little statements. "We are increasingly asked to read different things in different ways, from emojis to social media feeds, speed reader phone apps to public information screens. This combination of new locations and new forms of text makes reading both more common and more difficult to grasp, putting pressure on our attention and reading abilities and demanding new forms of literacy." So in this, they created an exhibition in which they offered an alternative vision of a library and how a library can function. And they're interested in how libraries work with categorization and organization. So that's again with space and time. So you can also have a look at that in your own time. There's lots of nice documentation of their of what they've worked with. They work with philosophers, writers, artists, and yeah. So I will leave you to look at that yourselves, and maybe now would be a good time for us to have a little discussion about some of these things.